Hello there, Booktube. So, this isn't the video I was planning to make, but I'm gonna have to postpone what I was gonna make because the ingredients don't exist. So this video is something a little bit different. What I was going to do was I was going to make a video called The Beginner's Guide to Conservative Booktube. Or something along those lines. I hadn't decided exactly on the title. And I was going to try to find some conservative booktubers that reviewed books from a right-leaning perspective. Because I think that there's precious little of that on Booktube. And there's bound to be some people who want that perspective. There must be. After all, conservatism accounts for a significant amount of the population. World population-wise, it's probably around half the world population, maybe more, the whole conservative viewpoints. Conservatism is a very mainstream perspective. So, why is it that it's basically not shown on Booktube? And that's a question I really need to ask. Because in order for me to make this top conservative booktubers, there needs to be conservative booktubers, and there isn't. Booktube is interesting in that it is extremely left-wing. Now, all hobbies have this issue. All hobbies appeal to specific groups. So, reading appeals to women, and apparently appeals to the extreme left. And I don't know quite why. Video games have the same issue. They skew heavily male, and they also skew slightly right-wing. You get a lot of people within video games that are very pro-freedoms, and a lot of practical philosophy out of video games. But that makes a lot of sense. When you think about what video games are, video games require you to work hard and practice in order to achieve something in a competitive arena, which is very similar to how people ideally view capitalism, and it also is deeply meritocratic, which is something that the right wing appreciates. So, being good at video games naturally appeals to right-wingers, or at least it should. There are other aspects of video games. There are plenty of video games that allow you to express your personality, your emotional self, which is something that attracts left-wing people way more. So there's also a lot of artistic expression. So you can be pretty much any ideology and enjoy video games. And we see this all the time. There are plenty of very, very left-wing YouTube channels covering video games, and there are plenty of very right-wing YouTube channels covering video games. So the community exists on all sides. I would say it skews slightly right-wing, but I can't say that for sure. I could be wrong. Maybe I've got a bias because that's the stuff I happen to have seen. Booktube's different. Booktube is exclusively left-wing. And that concerns me a little. What I originally wanted to make was a beginner's guide to conservative booktubers, where I highlighted some channels and recommended different perspectives, because I thought that left-wing and right-wing people are going to have different perspectives on the same book. And it's always good to get multiple different points of view, because then you understand whether or not you're going to enjoy something more. It also allows you to discuss it more and to engage with it more. After all, if we're going to look at a work of literature and get some kind of philosophical value from it, then we're better off doing that, having heard multiple points of view, because then the ideas that we've got bubbling around inside our mind have been challenged from different perspectives and from different angles. Booktube, however, is still only catering to very, very niche groups, which explains why we still don't have Booktube channels that have millions of subs. Jesse the Reader, for example, is still at less than 500,000 subscribers, and he's one of the biggest Booktube channels out there. We have a few that have topped 400,000 views, 3 to 400,000 subscribers, sorry. And we've got I've got a fair few that are topping 100,000 subscribers. 200,000 subscribers is at about the popular Booktube. So, what can we expect from Booktube? Well, Booktube has a few different areas, and like I say, there isn't really a left-right divide. There's left and there's more left. We have a few areas though. We have the YA crowd, which seems to be the oldest section of Booktube. Booktube largely started as a Californian teen girl thing. It was a lot of teen girls, very American, very, very left-wing, reading the same kind of YA that you'd expect. So things like The Hunger Games, things like Divergent, the Maze Runner series, Fifth Wave, that kind of stuff. But you also would have a heavy focus on the YA fantasy romance trend, particularly the books of Cassandra Clare and Sarah J. Maas. Twilight was also huge, as was Harry Potter, but those are huge regardless. And they grew up with those, so they make sense as the big things. But what that means is there was a lot of urban fantasy, which has very little fantasy and a hell of a lot of pandering romance aimed at teen girls, and plenty of dystopia, all featuring a teen girl protagonist with a romance subplot, because it's all heavily teen girl books we're talking about here. This was Booktube for a while, and it grew out from there, which means that obviously from there you only really have a couple of audiences that you can grow to. You're not going to suddenly attract 40-year-old men if the entirety of the community is teen girls talking about Twilight and the Shadowhunters. So what we ended up with is two kind of branching off areas. We ended up with the fantasy section of Booktube, and we've ended up with the contemporary romance section of Booktube. And both of these are extremely left-wing still. There's no right-wing areas cropping up at all. The romance section is extremely female-dominated, as you'd expect. There is sections that read YA romance, some adult romance, some adult contemporary, but if it's not romance-focused, it tends to get buried. There are sections that are dominated by fetishizing the gay community, which is a bother. There are entire channels that read nothing but LGBT rep, which is frankly a little bit sad. Like that they will read like YA gay romance repeatedly, like over and over again. They'll read like 2 or 3 books in a row that are like even more than that, like 4 or 5 books in a row that are just nothing but teen boys having gay romances. That's it. It is quite telling that they only seem to want to read about these things, and it's usually young women reading about it, which either means one of 3 things. Either they are reading this because of some kind of titillation. This is a sexual fantasy of theirs, which, fair enough. I mean, men watch lesbian porn, I suppose, so fair enough. 2, these are women usually in their mid-20s. They're still thinking like teenagers, and they're reading just the teen literature that's around. And it just so happens that there is a hell of a lot of teen literature that is focused exclusively on having as many gay characters as possible. Or 3, and this is sadly I think the reason, they're doing it to virtue signal. They're doing it because they think they need to read books with gay people in them because they need to prove that they're not evil homophobes. There has been an offshoot of this, which they call sapphic, which just means lesbian. I don't know why it gets its own word, but it does. This makes more sense for women to be reading it. At least they can be involved. So I suppose gay women reading about women makes a lot of sense. But yeah, there is a heavy fetishization of the gay community in Booktube, and it's something that makes me noticeably uncomfortable. But then that's expected when we're talking about porn, and that's what erotica is. And there are multiple channels that read just plain erotica, like openly discuss and read erotica on YouTube. There aren't any conservatives making Booktube channels, but there are erotica-focused channels on Booktube. The level of direction that Booktube has gone in is quite frightening when you think about it. So yeah, I find that quite uncouth. I would, in the same way that I would cringe at the idea of finding a YouTube community that reviews porn. I have no desire or want to see that exist. Like, if I found a group of guys that were reviewing porn and like making videos, tagging each other and challenging each other to watch certain porn videos, that would bother me. That would be a bit gross. But there are booktubers that do this with erotica, openly talking about it, and it's a bit weird. Like the thing of course there is, it's all about sexual liberation, and sexual liberation is a very, very left-wing ideal. The idea of being overly open and overly permissive with sex is very left-wing. Speaking of which, there is, with it being very female-focused, there is a focus on female sexuality, which leads into feminism. Feminism is heavily overrepresented in Booktube. Almost every booktuber who talks about feminism is pro-feminist. Those who don't talk about politics tend to ignore the subject, but even when they're trying not to be political, there are channels that will avoid politics, but the way that they talk, just the odd one or two words they say, still indicate that they are pro-feminist. Feminism is presumed to be a truth within Booktube. You accept feminism because feminism is automatically good. That is the Booktube assumption. I can prove this because you can go to many, many Booktube Discord channels where you can discuss books, and almost all of them will have a no politics rule. However, discussing LGBT issues and feminism is always allowed. Not only is it allowed, it is encouraged, and it is an active part of the discussion. They will often even have a room set aside for LGBT discussions, and feminist discussions will be just considered the norm. If you say anything anti-feminist or any critique of the LGBT movements, you will be banned. I know because I have been. Their idea of no politics is no politics except the shit we think is fine. Except the shit that we want to promote, that you can talk about all day. No politics that we disagree with, is what they actually mean. This is very, very commonplace across Booktube, sadly. So again, very, very left-wing. Now, and that's not to say that the right-wing would have any specific opinion either way when it comes to the LGBT movements. There are a variety of different opinions across the right, but the left takes that as practically a new religion. So there's only really one perspective that they will entertain. So then you've got the other branch, which is the fantasy side of Booktube. The fantasy side of Booktube is growing and is kind of pushing against its boundaries. It's breaking a little. There are channels that are erupting out from various different key areas that are creating new little offshoots. The Library of Alexandria is a good example of this. whilst he's very entrenched in the very female-focused feminist part of Booktube, he also steps away from that a lot. He reads different books. He's very critical of YA, and there are a lot of channels that kind of offshoot from there that take inspiration from and follow on from many of the discussions that he starts. Myself included, I would say. Library of Alexandria is a channel I actively watch and actively enjoy. There are a few others. Mike's Book Reviews is a channel that's been going for a good long while, and he does not fit the normal demographics. His videos are apolitical, but we know from times when he's mentioned it that he is not left-wing, and his wife is openly and very vocally libertarian, which tends to skew right-wing, so I would presume he's right of centre, though he has said that he didn't vote for Donald Trump, so he's not Republican levels of conservative, which is fine. He's largely centrist, I would imagine then. But being centrist in a community where the average person is very left-wing to extremist over the top is basically about as right-wing as you're going to get now. A good example of this, again, is the Black Lives Matter issue. Black Lives Matter has been one of those stains on society where it doesn't matter what happens, Black Lives Matter will create divisiveness. They waited for the opportune moment to create a powder keg of racial-based riots, blamed white people for it, then set fire to a bunch of American cities and claimed that they were the good guys. Annoyingly, it was mainly white people in cosplay doing it. So it was a lot of white people claiming that a lot of other white people were racist bastards while setting fire to buildings, often in black neighbourhoods. And apparently this is called Black Lives Matter. This is the movement. God knows why so many people take it seriously. I really don't know. But yeah. Booktube was very, very Black Lives Matter supporting. In fact, being anti-Black Lives Matter in any way will likely get you banned from most Booktube communities. I would hazard to guess that that's likely openly in their rules, in fact. When it comes down to it, almost every Booktube channel, when the George Floyd stuff was happening, were making pandering videos about the black community and black voices, and even channels that should have known better would make pandering videos where they'd highlight black authors and shit like that. I made a point to call them out in the comments section on a fair few channels where I respected them for actually being generally apolitical and told them to grow the fuck up and stop it. Stop promoting terrorism and acting like it's normal. Just because this community is so sickeningly left-wing that this passes for normal doesn't mean that you should do it. But yeah, as you can guess, I'm not left-wing. But yeah. This fantasy community, though, whilst it has tried to break out a little bit, and there's little bits that separate it from the pack, there is still a growing trend. The same books are talked about all the time. Brandon Sanderson is like the focus point of most of these channels. And then there's other things like Wheel of Time is huge, but that's Brandon Sanderson adjacent because he finished off the series. Authors like Robin Hobb, hugely popular. The Malazan Book of the Fallen series is a big one at the moment, but that's only recent. Like, a couple of people all decided that they were going to read it around the same time, and then it kind of become a thing. There are a few others. Lord of the Rings gets undue praise for no good reason. A lot of people will claim that it's one of their favourite fantasy. Most of them haven't read it. prove me fucking wrong, bitches. You haven't read it. I know you haven't read it. Stop pretending you have. There are a few that make it to the top of the list. What tends to happen is one booktuber who has a tendency to do unique and original things will name one or two books that they're interested in. They'll advertise those books a little bit, and then they'll get picked up, and then every booktuber will cover the same books. So it usually tends to be the same 15 to 20 books that are covered. But everyone who's covering them is left-wing. There's no right-wing voices. And I wonder whether or not the right-wing part of Booktube is simply non-existent. It's not represented. And those books, the books that the right-wing would promote, are getting largely ignored. I thought I'd found the right-wing part of Booktube. I genuinely thought I'd found it. But nope. The only right-wing booktuber I found was someone called Taylor Romero. She has less than 400 subscribers, and her videos get single-digit views sometimes, which shows just how few conservatives are actually watching YouTube. I thought that maybe this was what I was going to make the original video about, the whole beginner's guide to conservative booktube. This was why I was going to make this. Is I was under the impression that that conservative booktube would focus more on different genres. I thought maybe conservatives would be more interested in sci-fi and dystopia. And the reason for this is I've seen conservative book clubs and conservative news channels, things like that, that will occasionally talk about books. And those channels will often be very reverent towards certain authors, classical dystopian authors, such as Aldous Huxley, George Orwell, Ray Bradbury. You get the idea there. There are certain people who just crop up in these discussions, and usually it's people who are making books, who are writing books that are political in nature. There's an obvious reason why conservatives would push George Orwell's 1984. So I want to see if outside of political motivated books there was a trend for conservatives. Like, what do conservatives enjoy outside of obviously conservative leaning books? Because if you've got a fantasy book where there is a strong independent woman who fights against the patriarchy, brings down the feudal system with all the men in charge. She also happens to have non-white skin, and there's a gay relationship in the background somewhere. That is clearly progressive bait. Or almost every epic YA fantasy that has been written in the last 10 years. Right. Or as everyone else calls it, Priory of the Orange Tree. But yeah, if you have these kinds of things happening, then you're going to have the opposite for conservatives, presumably. There's going to be fantasy books where instead of it focusing on feminist ideals, instead of it being all about bringing down the man, instead of it being an excuse for identity politics, there's going to be the opposite. There's going to be books around the idea of tradition and family. There's going to be books around protectionism and the national ideal. Surely these things must exist in fantasy literature. And if you could find conservative booktubers, they would notice these trends and they would speak on them, and you'd get a different perspective. That was what I was hoping. Because whilst I find the left-wing trends to be something that does not appeal to me, I still want to be able to hear about them. I still want to know when they exist in books. I still want to hear the different perspectives. So even the left-wingers are going to want to hear the right-winger perspective, because then they can avoid books that they find that don't appeal to them. They'll know that you can have someone who disagrees with you completely diametrically and still enjoy their reviews. If you, for example, are a cultural Marxist feminist ideologue, then you should subscribe to my channel, because I guarantee if I hate a book, you'll fucking love it. I'll be the best critic you could possibly follow. You'll hate what I have to say, but it'll be useful. You'll know when a book is exactly what you want. If I like a book, chances are you're going to find it offensive, because you're going to find things that I find perfectly normal will be somehow emblematic of knowing the left wing, probably white fucking supremacy, because they blame everything on that. But you get my point. You're going to find things that I find normal and reasonable to be offensive examples of some kind of privilege-based society, whereas everything that I find to be annoying and frustrating, you're going to see as strong and brave and all of that nonsense. So you should be subscribed to my channel, and I will take the piss out of you, of course. But you can also downvote all of my videos if you like. We'll have that symbiotic relationship. I'll take the piss out of you. You'll downvote and leave a hate comment. We'll get on. That works. We know where we stand with each other. The thing is, the conservative voice just doesn't exist, and I find that concerning. I find that weird. In video games, you can find both. You can find extremely left-wing people like Jim Sterling, and you can find extremely right-wing people like Razorfist. Like, these are opposite sides of the coin, but they still talk about the same topics. They're still part of the YouTube gaming experience. You can't find that on Booktube, and I think that's a bit weird. So I'm actually going to put it out there. I want to build a right of centre Booktube community. I want to build this up. I want to promote conservative ideals, conservative perspectives in Booktube. I want to find conservative Booktubers. So if you know of conservative Booktubers, if you are a conservative who reads books, I want to hear from you. And I want to know what you've got to say, even if I disagree with it. Like, I actually consider myself fairly centrist. If anything, I actually consider myself to be left-wing. Just not the left-wing that most people consider to be left-wing. I'm a classical liberal, and I've always leaned towards socialism. I'm just also very culturally and socially libertarian. And that has now become the purview of the right, which is weird as all hell. Like, growing up in the 90s, I was very left-wing. I was vocally and extremely left-wing. It is bizarre finding that the left-wing has changed its ideology to such a degree that I no longer recognise it. But yeah, that beside the point. I still want to see the alternatives. I would love to see perspectives that I consider to be to the right of me. Like, quite considerably to the right of me. I would love to see conservative voices. I'd love to see Republican voices. I would like to see the reviews of fantasy books from the perspective of a Republican Christian. Because we don't hear that voice. That is a very, very mainstream perspective. Like, a devoutly religious Republican Christian voice, like the Southern Baptists or the Mormons, those kinds of churches. Right? I'm a classically liberal, socialist-leaning atheist. You could not get more different from me, you would think, unless you've got the progressive feminist Marxist, which is bizarre and I can't imagine. So I want to see that perspective, because I've heard this one, and frankly I'm sick of hearing this one. And I can give my perspective, and there's a range between the two. Like, it's mainly over here, like off towards the feminist. There's a range between the two, but this side, I hear none of this, and I want to hear it. So I would like to, I'd like to build a watch list. I would like to be able to go, here are 5 booktubers who give conservative interpretations of books. Now, I thought I found it, like I say, and it's all based around some of the older booktube channels, ones that have been around for a while. And they've been bubbling under the surface of booktube for a while now. They've been there since the YA, the little girls reading, Divergent trend was the big thing on booktube. They've been bubbling under the surface for all of that. And they read largely classics and literary fiction. They're a bit gatekeepy. They're a bit, pseudo-intellectual, arrogant prick at times. Sometimes they're quite nice, but they like to think they're better than people because they read books no sod's heard of. The key figure for this group tends to be Steve Donahue, who I thought was fairly right-wing, like at least right of centre, based on the way he described. He's just anti-progressivism. He's anti-SJW. He doesn't like identity politics and all that bollocks. And who does, really? So that makes sense. He's also extremely anti-Trump, and he is delusional in that he believes that Donald Trump orchestrated a huge, almost civil war-like takeover of the Capitol following the election of Joe Biden. He is convinced that there was some massive coup in place that was orchestrated by Trump and that very nearly led to the breakdown of the entirety of the United States, when in actual fact it was a protest that marched through the Capitol building that was almost completely without violence until one of the protesters was shot by the police for no good reason, which stands in stark contrast to the likes of the Black Lives Matter protests, where they set fire to buildings, had pitched fights with the police, often like fighting outright with SWAT police, burning down people's businesses, destroying property, and shooting people in the middle of the street for the hell of it. Many people have died because of Black Lives Matter and Antifa, and apparently they're the good guys according to the left wing. I don't understand left wing extremism. I just understand that it's sick. So I thought Steve Donahue was possibly the beginnings of a older, less not charismatic, but less out there part of BookTube. They make vlogs. They're not particularly edited. There's no flashy elements. They don't perform to the camera. There's none of this, hey guys, let's talk about my TBR. No, they don't do that crap. They talk largely like I am now, only probably with less gesticulation and less vocal variety. I tend to be quite passionate when I speak. These people really aren't. They are boomers who got hold of a camera and are just talking as if they're just having a chat in a library with someone. It's that the videos are quite boring a lot of the time. Because of that, what you end up with is a lot of old men in dimly lit rooms giving vlogs where they don't say very much of anything, and they don't really instill any excitement in the viewer. It's dreary and it's quite slow. But yeah, they're not particularly right wing though. They do cover classics. They do cover books that don't generally get talked about on BookTube, but sadly there's no performance in them. So that section of BookTube goes largely unnoticed, and most of them have less than 1,000 subscribers. Most of them get only a few hundred views per video, including Steve Donahue, despite the fact he's one of the longest running booktubers and probably the most prolific with the amount of videos he makes. Right. He's beating me out for views, but he's had years upon years to make content, and has at least 20 times as many videos as me. Whereas I make the occasional video, I don't have a decent schedule, and I haven't really put myself out there. Like, I expected Steve Donahue to be huge, and I got the impression he had a lot of hate view from the feminist identity politics crowd years ago, and then they cut him off, and he was effectively blackballed by the Booktube community. And because there's enough of those that have grown into the adult fantasy part of Booktube, there's still like the angry YA feminists that are still hanging on. There's always one or two of them who hate him with enough bile that he's just not welcome in any parts of Booktube. Like, if he showed up in like the Library of Alexandria's Shelf Space channel, he would be blocked pretty much instantly. But that said, the same thing happened to me, so they block people for fucking anything. Like, they blocked one guy on my from my Discord for making a joke from Futurama. So, you know, that's not really much of a bar to have to cross. Apparently making a reference to a cartoon is enough to get you blocked there. But yeah, I thought I'd found conservative Booktube, but I really hadn't. I'd found yet another part of right-wing Booktube. Another part of left-wing Booktube. I just found classical left-wing Booktube, like classical liberal workers' party kind of voters, the kind of people who would be Labour voters in Britain but are over the age of 40. That's what I basically found. Still no Conservatives. It's actually quite distractingly weird. If you look up Conservative Booktube or something along those lines, you find more videos of angry SJWs making rant reviews of the book Ben Shapiro wrote than you find conservative videos of any kind. That's the limit we're at here. So yeah, I'm going to try and discover some conservative Booktube and collate it and put it all together, and maybe link it all so that people who want a well-rounded version of the community can get it. Even if you're left-wing and you want more left-wing perspectives, surely you want to see the right-wing have a voice, because otherwise you're preaching to the converted and you have no real way of growing your numbers. So if you do care about politics, then you should want the other side to have a voice, because you can't challenge your opinions without it, and you can't convert anyone else unless they're there. So that was my deep dive, as it were, my exploration into conservative Booktube, and I'm sad to say it doesn't exist. Conservative everything else exists, liberal everything else exists, progressive everything else exists, but on Booktube you have progressive Booktube and don't want to rock the boat, don't talk about politics Booktube, which is either people who are possibly conservative but just don't want to make themselves the pariah. They don't want to oust themselves, because having this mainstream opinion will get you hate blocked by a vast majority of the community, or they just don't care about politics, which is fair. There's usually a solid, I'd say 30 to 40% of any community that's broadly centrist and doesn't care. The problem is that broadly centrist and doesn't care is not centrist anymore. It's now off to one side. And that's what I want addressed. Anyway, I've been rambling now for well over half an hour, so I'm going to leave it there. And we'll readdress this after a while. I'm going to come back to this in about a year, I think. Let's give it a year and let's see how many conservative voices we can find on Booktube in a year. I wonder if we can actually make a full top 10. We'll see. Until next time. Bye.